happy to introduce tonight's lecturer, Mia Lopez, who will illuminate the strong cultural ties Chicago and Mexico have held for the past century. Mia Lopez is the assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum. She has over 10 years of experience in the arts, most recently as the curatorial fellow at the Walker Art Center. She is an alum of the Smithsonian Latino Museum Studies Program and the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Leadership Institute, and has degrees from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Rice University. She has been a participant in the Lit and Loose Festival of Language, Literature, and Art, which presents culture exchange and collaboration between writers, artists from Chicago and Mexico City. The festival returns to Chicago this October 18th through 21st. And now we will begin.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me this evening and for the kind introduction. I'd like to begin by kind of explaining the research that I will be presenting today. This is really the first time that I have presented all of this information in this way. It's kind of threads of different projects and issues and histories that I've been delving into over the years. And it was really upon the invitation to present something in the context of both the Power Project, but also thinking about Lit Lose and the connection between Mexico and Chicago, that I thought, okay, let me get some of these different areas of research that I have, combine them, and see if that will be interesting to people. So hopefully it will be. I have, simultaneously we'll have some notes that I will be, referring to, but I really do kind of see this as not only a work in progress, but, an attempt to kind of start a conversation. I was really wanting to think about this, century of artistic collaboration, exchange, and dialogue. It's such a broad topic, and in a way it can be, kind of an overwhelming thing to think about. How do two of the largest cities in the world, how have they had a relationship? How has that evolved over time? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from that? So I want to present this and then really kind of open up the floor to have a little bit of a dialogue. Particularly, I'm interested in hearing from other practitioners, was this information new to you? Did any of the examples that I will be bringing up inspire, or perhaps provoke, an idea or a kind of a line of questioning that may be applicable in your own practice? So, without further ado, I'll kind of go into how I am thinking through this topic. Really, the premise of the entire approach is, what are the origins of Chicago's deep ties to Mexico's artistic communities? And I say that because I think that, in 2017, we can all acknowledge that, yes, Chicago and Mexico have, particularly Mexico City, have a long history of working together. We have seen, some incredible exhibitions of Mexican art. We see artists kind of coming back and forth, whether they are coming in pursuit of education, through residencies and other programs that are kind of more formal ways of working, but also informally. We see people that are coming here because they're just drawn to this hub, and of course, vice versa. I mean, how many people, have been either traveling to Mexico City or have it on their list of places that they really want to get to soon? I have to admit, I've only been once, so I need to get back. I know. So that is one of many caveats to keep in mind with this presentation, that I am very much, biased in the sense of my experience with Mexico City has been as an American, as somebody that, is very much firmly rooted on this side of the border, yet, in case you didn't notice, my own cultural heritage is from Mexico. So particularly with some of the visual culture that we're going to be getting into, I find that really fascinating to kind of see how our own cultural biases, both implicit and otherwise, may shift the way that we kind of read this information, artwork and visual culture. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm specifically going to look at kind of three different categories, albeit, again, by no means a comprehensive look at any of them, but instead just some interesting facts and information that some of which I was familiar with and some other things that I kind of uncovered that I thought were really interesting. Beginning with the World's Fair, because I think so often when we talk about Chicago history, we kind of go back to either the fire or 1893. So I want to unpack a little bit why 1893 might be this, moment of kind of a cultural awakening in Chicago. I also want to touch on some of the origins of the social movements and particularly, kind of labor and immigrant activism in this city. And then last, very briefly, touch on some notable museums and exhibitions that, at least for me as a young curator, have been very formative and kind of, I think of as sort of touchstones for representation of Mexican art and art history in this city. So I'd like to begin by presenting this image that I think in so many ways speaks to what was sort of the mission of the Columbian Exposition in 1893. This was after the Great Fire, and the city wanted so badly to show the rest of the world that they had overcome, what could have been quite devastating for many other cities around the world. And not only that they were rebuilding, but that they had come back better than ever, and they were really rolling out the red carpet to cultures from around and other countries from around the world to share their innovation, their ideas, their music, their food, but also to take that as an opportunity to show off what they considered to be the best of Chicago. So this image was actually kind of an advertisement, but it was also something that was produced in a way that they wanted people to collect this. So this was very much kind of a sort of accessible art form that anybody who was fortunate enough to have access to kind of written and printed materials might have wanted to hold on to. And it was part of a kind of series, so you would have been able to compile your own, I guess, sort of like booklet or own collection of images related to the fair. And what you're seeing is Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty gesturing to a crowd that is, of course, different icons and sort of stereotypes of what the rest of the world's culture look like. Something I do want to point out, of course, is the composition and the way that Lady Liberty and Uncle Sam are, of course, much larger and kind of put in a position of sort of domineering, kind of welcoming, but also, they have, the stature is one where you see kind of, again, dominance over these other groups. And something I think, has been discussed, of course, in many ways is the idea of sort of cultural imperialism that is inherent to the fairs. It happened when Paris was hosting. When any country was hosting one of these world fairs, they would, of course, want to elevate their culture. But what's interesting is that, as the United States was really rising as a national power, how these fairs coincided with important kind of economic moments in world history as well. So at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Mexico was represented in several different pavilions, including agriculture and fine arts, and they also had their own space. The Mexican Temple Pavilion incorporated replicas of what was referred to in the official paperwork as Yucatan ruins that were actually made out of paper mache. So that's what you're seeing on the right. It was interesting because in some of the literature that documented the World's Fair, these were not explained that it was paper mache. And there was it was so interesting kind of the way that visual culture circulated during that time. So many of the print materials for the fair were actually done so far in advance that in a way they don't always accurately represent what really happened. So there's kind of a mythology around the fair that I think still is perpetuated through the continuous dissemination of some of the, brochures and memorabilia from that time in a way that's not always, fully annotated, saying, okay, this is, perhaps an incorrect way of describing this object. In any case, these were part of sort of an anthropological approach to displaying Mexican culture. And something that I uncovered, in preparing for this evening, but also just in general and looking at the way that different countries prepared their expositions at the fair, there was always a tension between how do we exhibit the best of our, country, whatever, the nationalist pride is centered around, yet acknowledge the expectations of, the host venue. In this case, Americans in Chicago that would have had actually fairly limited exposure to Mexican culture at that time. I should point out that there were some Mexicans living in Chicago at the time of the World Fair, but by no means was it, a large population at all. I think the figures that I was looking at were estimated to be maybe a few hundred. So to put that, in context. There's also this gentleman to the left, Jose Maria Garcia, who was a Mexican vaquero. He actually was not part of the Mexican pavilion or presentation. He was with Buffalo Bill's rodeo presentation. So that to me was sort of interesting. He clearly had some amount of agency in deciding that he wanted to participate in this, but I should say, full disclaimer, my graduate thesis, I looked at sort of ethnographic representation at the fair in the context of some contemporary artists, but I, had looked at the way that particularly people of color and indigenous people were exploited at World's Fairs and at times through sideshows, honestly through the present day. There's still occasionally you'll go to a state fair and see some really problematic representations of people that are that have either different conditions or maybe have been separated from their home culture. So in any case, I was interested in this image, which is actually now being sold as a collector's item. I think I found this image on Amazon. So Mexico was actually the only Spanish-American country that was allotted space in the art galleries. And they were one of very few that received all of the space that they had asked for. So if this is really small font, so you may not be able to see, but the United States has about maybe a dozen different galleries, France as well, Great Britain, basically all of their allies get a ton of space. And also, the countries that were sort of believed or perceived to be kind of the pillars of, arts and culture. And Mexico got, I think a few little spaces over there. So they, however, it was noted in the catalog that accompanied the exhibition that Mexico received all of the space that they asked for. And then later on, I found notes that actually the Mexican pavilion organizers had submitted their proposal for the Fine Arts Gallery at the very last minute, perhaps even technically after the deadline. So there is, a possibility maybe they would have gotten more space if they had submitted it on time. But it was, I think sort of the focus had been on more of commerce, agriculture, and realms that were, traditionally considered to be lucrative. And it was something of an afterthought in some ways that, how can we announce ourselves at the fair that maybe fine art would help kind of underscore their national identity. So the expedition organizers had a very interesting goal of education that they proclaimed in the guidebook that was all illustrations of the work in the fair. And so I'm going to read from this publication, which I should say did not include reproductions of any of the Mexican artworks. Several countries were excluded. They didn't have anything from Japan or, actually it might have just been Mexico and Japan that were excluded now that I look at this full list. So that was interesting to me as well. So in the publication, they explain that the mission of the Fine Art Gallery was to bring together productions of various classes from all portions of the globe, an opportunity that is afforded for study and comparison. Each exhibitor may learn something from almost every other exhibitor in his class, which may be to his advantage, and which may lead to the improvement of that which he produces, whether it be in the domain of art or manufacture. At the same time, the general visitor of the exposition likewise may gain new ideas and correct impressions that have been formed upon insufficient or erroneous data, end quote. So I thought that was really interesting that they acknowledged that there were two types of viewers that would be seeing this work. People that were artists and producers themselves, and people that were just regular, average Joes that may not have ever, seen this art or perhaps had different, ideas of what cultural production from these different countries looked like. So Mexico's exhibition actually consisted primarily of historic and religious themes, portraiture, landscapes, and a few other subjects. The sculptures included busts of political leaders, so they included Porfirio Diaz, Benito Juarez, Carlos Pacheco, and Felipe Berriozabal. Those were done by Gabriel Guerra and Jesus Contreras. And then there were paintings that related to historic scenes and personages of Mexico, which were in very, kind of a strong contrast to what was considered to be alienism of the United States collection. Of course, there was also the mythical founding of Mexico City in 1521 that was depicted by Jose Jara. But the standout of the Mexican art exhibition was Jose Maria Velasco. He presented over 20 different landscape paintings. And although in 2017 we hear landscape and maybe feel like yawning, at the time, landscape was incredibly romantic and sexy and just considered to be the utmost depiction of skill, and what a way to kind of capture the identity of the country and sort of inspire national pride. So he did this series that was Valleys of Mexico, and all kind of located them in different parts of the country's geography. This is the Valley of Mexico from the Santa Isabel mountain range on the right, and that's actually a detail of the left. So his series of lush landscapes of the valleys, they were considered really to be a national triumph and overshadowed many of the contributions from the better-known European artists. So he combined historical allegory and romantic aesthetics to become symbols of national patriotism, in many ways kind of anticipating some of the calendar artists and kind of more popular art forms that would be emerging 20 years later. What's interesting also, again, to keep in mind is that although there were many different art forms that were presented, all of this was considered unbelievably innovative, and in some ways, it may have been the first real art exhibition of Mexican art in the United States. There's, of course, I think a lot of unpacking of that proclamation, but a few different instances in literature related to the World's Fair, as well as kind of historical accounts afterwards, indicate that. So I find that really fascinating that in a context of a World Fair, which is all about national pride, Mexico gets to kind of slip in and present artwork in this country for the very first time. I also read one account, I wasn't sure if I was going to mention it because I wasn't able to find another source that confirmed this, but that Jose Maria Velasco won like the grand prize of the art fair. So that's really interesting too, to kind of think about this underdog coming in and potentially taking the biggest prize and recognition of the entire fair. So fast forward to 1934, and it's time for another World's Fair, because apparently in Chicago you just can't get enough of showing off all of the great things in this city to the rest of the world. So there was less of a fine art representation at the fair, but I wanted to look at a few examples of the visual culture, and particularly, we have vernacular architecture here, sort of echoing what would be considered kind of a Spanish-style architecture. That's the top. That would have been the Mexican village. And then we have two people that are reenacting a bullfight in the Mexican village. There was, again, still this idea that there needed to be sort of a cultural performance happening in this space. Never mind the fact that by this time there actually were Mexican immigrants coming to Chicago in very high numbers, and that there was much more familiarity with actual Mexican artists. There was still, through the lens of the fair and kind of the, what drove the people that were organizing that was, again, this very simple representation of the culture. Again, my interest kind of in sort of the exploitation of indigenous and kind of other marginalized groups, including women. I was fascinated by this image of Rosita Perez, who was a hostess at the Century of Progress Mexican Pavilion. It's at times referred to as the Pavilion or as the Village. And she not only would have greeted people, talked to them, but she also danced. And then on the right, this was a souvenir menu for the restaurant at the Century of Progress. And as you see, when you open it up, you get a surprise and you get to see a nude woman that's dancing. What that has to do with food and your dining experience, I don't know. I was hoping to find a reverse image to see what was on the menu, because I was really curious about what sort of Mexican cuisine would have been like in Chicago in 1934. But the style of this type of drawing, to me, is really interesting because it is, in a way, sort of evocative of some of the pinup that's happening at the same time. And although there's very little information about kind of the graphic arts that were being created around the fair as far as who were the actual artists and designers, I think it's interesting that they sort of speak to an attempt to reconcile two different aesthetic traditions. At the same time, I should have included an image of one of kind of the Mexican classical kind of calendars, but there is this sense of embodying the country's sort of image as a beautiful woman, typically kind of a lighter to more olive complexion, by no means a darker complexion, because that would have been kind of frowned upon within Mexican culture. And again, sort of this idea that a seductress was a way to kind of call in the American tourist. And tourism really was closely connected to the fair, and this idea of enticing people to travel to Mexico and to spend time there. So from World War I on, Mexicans began arriving to the near west side near the Hull House. So we're kind of overlapping a little bit with the 1934 exposition. So the Hull House was, of course, I think most people are familiar with it, but in case you're not, a settlement house that was founded in 1889 by Jane Addams, and they were really committed to social justice. They offered civic, social, and cultural programs that were primarily for surrounding working class immigrant communities. By 1930, the Mexican population in Chicago was up to 20,000. So if you think about in 1893, there was literally, records had maybe 100 people, to up to 20,000. That's a huge influx in about 40 years. And this population was contributing to what is today the second largest Mexican community in the United States. As this population was growing, the Hull House residents and the people that were running the space there responded by actually opening up their complex for meetings and educational programs and really inviting in their new neighbors. So from 1927 to 1937, the Hull House kilns were being operated as a commercial pottery center. They were located in the Boys Club building, and there people could not only kind of learn sort of an arts and craft approach, but they also were producing dinnerware and decorative ceramics. They were sold at the Hull House and at the Hull House shop. So the shop actually had opened at Michigan and Ohio, so one of the first stores on the Mag Mile, and it later moved to further north on Michigan. So the artists that were working there produced decorative pieces, and they actually received 45% of the sales price. The kilns then also received 45%, and then the shop took about 10%, just to cover their overhead and expenses. And the pieces were produced by teachers and neighbors, including men. So it was really interesting that this was a folk craft that in Mexico maybe would have been more closely associated with women's work. This continues to kind of be an unfortunate problematic stereotype of many craft forms, but this was something that men were taking part in as well. And as you see, they produced dishes and also decorative objects. So the migrants that came from the middle of, many of them came from the middle of Mexico. They actually had craft traditions in their home states, but many of them did not learn that until they arrived themselves to the Hull House. And there were a few teachers there that had been fortunate enough to travel to Mexico, one of whom I believe even had connected with Diego Rivera, and through that was able to kind of find ways to kind of bridge the folk tradition with this more contemporary production. So the Hull House Art School, they offered ceramics classes to children and adults. And while some of the classes were for Mexicans only, many of them were integrated. The Hull House believed in, quote, bringing together the different nationalities, which was in they had a booklet that was called Pottery from Hull House, that was, quote, for the interchange of ideas and techniques. Italian, Greeks, Mexican, Chinese, and Negro children can work enthusiastically together in the children's classes and learn to respect each other's personalities, work, and abilities, end quote. So I think it's interesting, again, here's another educational sort of, credo of through art, we're going to kind of bring people together. We're going to learn from each other by sharing artwork, which I think in so many ways is a kind of manifesto that sort of seems to emerge about every 20 years, and that's kind of the rallying cry for like why we make. It's from multiculturalism going back to the Columbian Exposition, there's this idea that through making we can kind of arrive at some type of universal understanding. So the Hull House kilns closed in 1937, largely due to the Great Depression. Very few people could afford the dinnerware and decorative items that they were producing. And there was, at this time, many Mexicans were being forced to return to Mexico, either by choice or they were being repatriated by the US government because they were seeing, many of them were coming, pursuing work opportunities, and of course with the Depression there was this preference that was being given towards American laborers as well. Then in 1936, for those of you that are familiar with decorative pottery, decorative ceramics and dinnerware, you may have noticed that the works on the left bear a striking resemblance to fiesta ware, which is of course produced to this day. So in 1936, the Homer Laughlin China Company introduced the mass-produced fiesta ware, and that basically eliminated the market for this type of ceramic. And there's some great publications that the Hull House has produced that go so much more in depth than I would ever be able to today. I wanted to recommend Pots of Promise, Mexicans and Pottery at the Hull House, which was published about 15 years ago. Something that was also happening at the Hull House at this time was there was a painter named Adrian Lozano who had been employed by the Works Progress Administration. It's important to note that the entire WPA was massively influenced by the Mexican muralist movement, and seeing how governments could employ artists and really not only put them to work in a kind of practical way, but you sort of help utilize them to kind of spread a message of either goodwill or sort of political unity. So this work was installed at Hull House, and I think it was in kind of like a dining room area. However, through renovations, it was destroyed, which is a shame because it was believed to be the very first Mexican mural in the city. And so Adrian Lozano was at the Hull House for some time. He did have an artistic practice kind of beyond the Hull House, although I'm just starting to kind of learn about him. And I'll talk about a project that he's going to be featured in later on in this talk. So also kind of in the same time period was the founding of Taller de Gráfica Popular. I knew in kind of preparing materials today that I wanted to find a way to sort of speak to the interchange between sort of some of the social realists that were here in Chicago, but also the acknowledging that those ideals were so, fundamentally kind of Mexican. Looking at Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, all of the great muralists, and the way that they were depicting laborers as, as dignified, but also, profoundly struggling, of course, aligned so much with the same type of issues that artists that were working in Chicago faced. So Taller de Gráfica Popular was or I guess it still exists in some form, is an artist print collective that was founded in Mexico in 1937 by artists Leopoldo Martinez, Pablo O'Higgins, and Luis Arenal. And the collective was primarily concerned with using art to advance revolutionary social causes as they emerged and evolved in the crucible of anti-fascist and leftist politics in Mexico in the period surrounding World War II. So this shaped not only the workshop's dedication to a collective printmaking model, but also this production was aimed at reaching regular people and discerning collectors. So it was finding a way to kind of have a strong message, but also to execute that in a very aesthetically pleasing way. So the collective, they created works for groups that spanned the leftist and progressive political spectrum, including the government of Cárdenas and his successors, the Mexican Communist Party, several trade unions, and anti-fascist organizations. During the Taller de Gráfica Popular's kind of heyday, which really was from like 1937 through the 1950s, they produced thousands of prints, which were primarily lino cuts and lithographs that were everything from ephemeral handbills to newspapers that had sort of political messages or perhaps were even just for advertising. They favored a very expressive, realist visual language, and their work addressed a wide range of socially engaged themes, including Mexican history and culture, political satires that could be both locally focused or international, and this actually, they were continuing the tradition of Posada, who had created what was the calavera image that was an iconic kind of satirical image and way of kind of representing many issues in Mexican culture. The members of this workshop, which were at its largest about 40 people, they produced individual and collective works, and most notably, pertaining to our conversation here today, they welcomed many foreign members and guest artists, from Elizabeth Catlett to Joseph Albers, and they allowed them to use the workshop in order to collaborate on prints and create individual pieces. Of course, also, sharing their unique ideas and perspectives. So these works, let's see, here's a few, kind of illustrate the aesthetically and politically informed dialogues that were happening at the time between Chicago-based and Mexican artists. The Taller Gráfica Popular had a profound impact on much of this work that was being produced. So Elizabeth Catlett actually went down to Mexico City to work with the Taller and kind of never left. She found her community there and continued to make work with them, I think really until her death. Margaret Burroughs was friends with her, and when Elizabeth became involved with them, she took that as an opportunity to go and travel and spend time with her friend, but also be exposed to kind of a different type of art making that, of course, had a profound impact on her career in the way that she was already kind of approaching these socially engaged ideas. She would have traveled, I think, in like the late 40s. So this was late 40s, early 50s. I think she made multiple visits. This would have been before she had kind of I think, officially founded the Ensemble, but she was already engaged with so many of the issues that, of the civil rights era. And in many ways, the artists that were then mentored by, Margaret Burroughs and Elizabeth Catlett were exposed again to this strong socialist realist approach to making, but also, being taught quite, literally and practically the skills needed to mass produce work and kind of disseminate that as, essentially kind of a form of propaganda. And this would really come into play with the civil rights. To point out this piece on the right, this is and a special fear for my loved ones from the I Am a Negro, the Negro Woman series that Elizabeth Catlett had done. And what you're seeing is a very difficult image of a lynching. In so many ways, although the political issues that Black Americans were and other minorities were facing in the United States, of course, were so localized and so distinct to our country, there was also this ability to I think for the Mexican artist to kind of understand this struggle and to be able to, if not, necessarily kind of commiserate, to be able to try and champion each other's movements. So there was this, through the Taller Gráfica Popular and other types of exchange at this time, there was an ability to sort of share stories of injustice and hopefully bring broader awareness to them and kind of draw attention to injustice and kind of work together more collaboratively towards a greater social good. Something else that I thought was really fascinating at this time was the role of some of the curators at the Art Institute who became aware of the Taller Gráfica Popular because of some of the Chicago artists that had been traveling there and ended up actually making some major acquisitions of work from this period that then became kind of the foundation of the Mexican print collection at the Art Institute. In 2014, there was a wonderful exhibition of this work that now I'm forgetting the name of the exhibition, of course, but look it up, just Taller Gráfica Popular at the Art Institute in 2014. And really, they have a publication that came along with that, and it talks about so many more individual artists that had profound experiences with this group, and then kind of begins to suggest the way that that would have impacted not just their individual practices, but kind of the collectives like the Black Artist Movement that were, of course, had such a huge impact here in this city. So I'm going to fast forward way ahead, leaving 1950. Now let's get into the mid-'80s. And as if you recall from my bullets at the beginning, I was going to talk about, to kind of wrap things up, about museums and exhibitions that are particularly important. And of course, no talk about the history of Mexican art, exchange in Chicago would be possible without acknowledging the National Museum of Mexican Art. It was founded by a group of teachers, and that has always sort of kept them closely tied to, of course, community art practices, but also a mission of education and a very much kind of an institutional attitude of creating accessibility for everyone. The National Museum of Mexican Art was actually the very first culturally specific, or at least Latino museum, maybe the second or third culturally specific, because the Studio Museum in Harlem preceded them, museum to get a accreditation from the American Association of Museums, which is the largest organization of museums and kind of sets best standards, sets what best practices and kind of the highest standards for museums are. And they are also incredibly unique in the field of Latino arts and culture because they simultaneously will be working with what we would say are Latinx artists and Mexican artists. And by exhibiting them side by side, they really kind of dismantle this idea that these are two distinct categories, and instead are able through group exhibitions and just juxtaposition of two different shows at once, ways to kind of demonstrate the ongoing influences and dialogues between people who are immigrants or maybe perhaps third or fourth generation in this country, as well as their counterparts in Mexico. In 2007, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and my fabulous boss and director, Julie Rodriguez-Whitholm, organized the exhibition Escultura Social, A New Generation of Art from Mexico City. That exhibition was incredibly notable because it really was the first major show in the United States of artists like Pedro Reyes, Abraham Cruz Villegas, whose work is centered here. And this was kind of looking at a group of artists that was largely clustered around kind of a hotbed within Mexico City that is the Gallery Curimansuto. But they were making work that very much challenged stereotypical notions of what Mexican art would look like. They were inspired more by Joseph Bois than they were by the muralists. And in many ways, this exhibition created or, properly kind of contextualized them in a way that maybe wasn't happening, quite as quickly as you would have expected in 2007. So this exhibition toured around the country and really, introduced many different people to artists that were, in many ways as cutting edge as some of the, artists coming out of New York, but because they were Mexican artists, we were not necessarily exhibiting quite as much. And what's fascinating to me as somebody who works in contemporary art is that, in the 10 years since this exhibition, all of those artists have had major projects around the world. It also, this project, Escultura Social, spoke to a kind of globalization of Mexico City and the Mexico City art scene, and really sort of announced in so many ways the perception from the contemporary art world in the United States that Mexico City was a contemporary art destination, or is. Last, I want to look to the future. So as I prepared for this talk, I knew that I needed to call my good friend and colleague, Cesario Moreno, who is the curator of the National Museum of Mexican Art. And I basically said, Cesario, this is such a huge topic, and I want to make sure that I find a way to present it in a way that is engaging and accessible, but also, I want to make sure that I provide people with resources to learn more from people that are perhaps more of an expert, such as you. And it just so happens that they have announced this exhibition that will be part of Art Design Chicago, opening in March 2018, that is Arte Diseño Chicago. And he is actually doing a lot of research into the ceramicists that were at the Hull House. Much like my research has kind of been trying to identify who were the earliest Mexican artists in Chicago. Cesario has really kind of begun to create a timeline. And, definitely complicating and upsetting the idea that there is kind of a linear way that people have been moving through the city, but instead seeing that people have come and gone, that as Chicago itself became a destination for artists, it also has been a destination for laborers, and understanding that people maybe would come here with one intention and have another experience altogether, whether it be a very quick exposure to a community here that ultimately produced a larger artwork or kind of shifted somebody's practice, or at times it was an artist that just was passing through, and he's finding in notes that they reference something to Chicago. So the exhibition is going to be quite broad in that sense, as you can see, also starting at the Columbian Exposition and going through the Civil Rights era. One thing that I understand that they will be looking at is the founding of Casa Azatlan, which was an important cultural center in Pilsen. And I mention it because if you have been following the stories around gentrification in Pilsen, just last week, the really massive murals that had been up for decades and were seen as iconic and sort of emblematic of the Mexican and Chicano community in Pilsen were literally whitewashed as part of the gentrification of that community. And so I know that will come up through some of the conversations that they will be having in that exhibition. And of course, on the right, in October is the next iteration of the Lit Lose Festival, where you'll be able to hear about ongoing intersections of arts and culture and literature between Chicago and Mexico City cultural producers. So with that, I'd love to open up the floor to questions, comments, any feedback, and thank you so much for joining me. Yes, Ross.
What if you read any accounts of Mexicans actually visiting the fair? We found things like that.
I'm really happy that you asked that question because I did not. And what I did find, though, so for the 1893 exposition, I did find one account of actually Jose Maria Velasco, and he was writing a postcard home, and it's so good. He's totally in shock because somebody on the street was selling a tamale. And he was like, wait, what? What's going on? So I think, as we all know, sometimes our stomachs are more attuned to cultural trends than, our eyes or everything else. Like, things can just kind of be shared faster that way, if that makes any sense. So he noted that, but that was kind of the only personal account that I have found that just yet. As I said, this is kind of an ongoing research project for me. I'm just sort of hitting the tip of the iceberg in that. Something that is really important that I want to kind of spend some time with as it pertains both to the Columbian Exposition and the later Century of Progress exhibition is the inherent hypocrisy of presenting these pavilions and kind of extolling the greatness of the city when there was still segregation and full-on racism. Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass actually authored a really important document that was a protest of the Columbian Exposition, and they talked about the absence of Black people in the different representations, but also kind of what they felt was sort of a hostility towards them. I think that there had been some specific days that people were invited to attend, but it was depicted in a very racist cartoon called Darky's Day at the Fair, and it was specifically what they called their Negro Day, and they invited people and served watermelon. So it was, it's important to kind of look through yes, there was incredible cultural accomplishment that happened, but there was also, of course, pervasive racism throughout. Any other questions? Yes.
So the people that were exhibited
Yes.
for the thing, did any of them stay in Chicago, or did they were all transferred back? Like, we were here for these days, we don't need you no more, we're sending you back.
That's a great question. There's so many different instances. What's so tragic is that these people had very, very little agency themselves. They were, in some ways, kind of modern slaves. They were, under the control of the people that had hired them there. It was kind of almost like an indentured servant kind of thing, or they needed to fulfill their contract. At times, they might be, so not so much with this fair, but with, gosh, I'm forgetting his name. He was at the Queens Zoo. I included him in my graduate thesis, but I just can't think of his name. But he had been brought to the United States to be exhibited, and essentially was told, oh, well, we can give you sort of a house at the zoo, which they led him to believe would be a better accommodation. And so he felt like he was making that choice for himself and perhaps, for his family. But he became so depressed at the way that he was treated that he committed suicide. So I don't know of any instances that were directly tied to the fair, but there's so many. You can see there's images of Seminole Indians from Florida, and in some instances they actually attempted to create environments and structures that mimicked their homes, which of course, were totally in contrast to the architecture of the rest of the fair. And they sort of wanted that contrast to kind of make literally they called it the White City. They wanted it to look, even more sparkling and clean and new. So, sure. Yes.
There are a couple other Chicago the Chicago Surrealist Group.
Yes.
Who are also, who run the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company, which is a Chicago institution, was the oldest radical publisher in the country. So she had collaborations with them. They did Exquisite Corpses together, and things like that, before she finally did move back to Mexico City, where she eventually died. And also, the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company had Carlos Cortez, who was very closely associated with the Mexican National Movement.
Yes.
He edited a book called Viva Posada, which is a little small collection of Posada prints. So there's another connection for Chicago.
Thank you for that. Was Leonora also a bit of a collector? Was that?
I'm not sure what that.
There may be somebody else that I'm confusing her with, but
A lot of sculptures, some of which are huge salons now, all around Mexico City. They just pop up surprising places. How will they do?
I cannot speak for the National Museum of Mexican Art, but I would not be surprised if she was included on their checklist. I'm really excited to see how that exhibition is going to come together, but thank you so much for sharing that. Any other questions? Well, thank you again. Oh, we have one in the back.
You made me hungry and curious about what kind of food was around at the turn of the century, but I'm going to have to run through the special collections in my parks. I think I can go to Park, and they collaborate a lot with Paul House, and I'm sure there's some kind of interesting stuff in your cuisine.
Yes. So I didn't know if this was going to come up, but I'm from San Antonio, Texas, which is home of chili con carne, which had its debut at the World's Fair. And tragically, I think that was the last time that it was ever served in Chicago, because I cannot find it here to save my life. 7 years in the Midwest, and I basically, first thing I do whenever I get to San Antonio is go straight for some enchiladas with chili con carne, so. My fiance can vouch for that. We're going home for the 4th of July, and I'm just like, first stop. Well, thank you all again. I'll be around for any one-on-one questions. And again, I really appreciate your sort of listening to my disparate thoughts and research, and I hope to continue to be able to share as I continue to dive into archives. So thanks.